Hi, Geoff.
Good morning, Mike. How are you?
Oh, I'm great. Just loving this atmospheric river and gloomy days we're having here.
I know that's what I was going to say. Listening to it come down, I was on Pender Island on the weekend and it was torrential, but
Uh,
it all drained away.
Well, as lifelong British Columbians, I guess that's what we signed up for, um, or someone signed us up for it.
Yeah,
Uh, well, today, Geoff, in the strategy suite, raindrops are falling on the head of Prime Minister Mark Carney, who's up in Prince Rupert, um, as we record this. We'll talk a bit about that, why he's
this
up
is on
there.
its way to China, a quick stop on its way to China.
That's right. Little pit stop in Prince Rupert, the city of rainbows, the halibut capital. Then the premier is away in India trying to increase trade. But next week he'll be in Prince George, where billions of dollars of potential investment await him. And we'll also talk about the conservative leadership candidate race. They're starting to make their move. Who's shaping up to be the conservative prince or princess?
Or princess, yeah.
And what do their palace courts look like? And we had some exclusive news this week that Hotel Pacifico released on who one of the campaign managers will be for one of the potential leadership candidates. But first, our special guest. No private member and certainly no independent MLA commands media attention like Elenore Sturko. In fact, she's probably more visible to British Columbians than most of the cabinet ministers in David Eby's government. What is it about Elenore Sturko that cuts through the noise and gets into our news feeds? Her tenacity, her intimate knowledge of the justice system, her flexibility when it comes to playing by the old political rules. She was elected in 2022 by-election as a star candidate with Kevin Falcon's BC Liberals, but pulled the ripcord and parachuted to the BC Conservatives in June 2024, not long after the first squadron of defectors had already jumped. Then in 2025, John Rustad ejected her from caucus on the first day of the UBCM convention. She carried her banker's box of personal possessions out into the legislature lawn where media laid in wait, amplifying the conservative narrative that things were not all right in the conservative caucus. A few months later, John Rustad was ejected as leader. But what did Elenore Sturko do before politics? Well, like many of our guests, she's from Kamloops. And she was a broadcaster in Kamloops with CFJC. That might explain her media savvy. She became a reservist, joined the RCMP, attaining the rank of staff sergeant, served in Langley, Yellowknife, Ottawa. And in Yellowknife, she participated in the Arctic Sovereignty Patrol, so maybe being frozen out by the Conservatives is second nature to her. She did a stint. After her stint in Ottawa, she found her way to Surrey, where she was stationed in 2018 and has been a fixture in Surrey ever since. Elenore, welcome to Hotel Pacifico.
Thanks very much.
Did I get that right?
You got it very right and very entertaining the way you put it. So I thank you for having me on. Appreciate that.
Tell us a bit about your first career, which was really, your policing career. Um, you had some brushes with journalism, but you did communications within the RCMP too. Like, um, have you been leaning on those? You've been leaning on those muscles in politics, obviously.
Yeah, I think my experience as a communications officer for the RCMP helped. It's funny because I never really in the beginning I was kind of voluntold to be the media relations officer the first time I did it. And at the time, the CO for G Division was looking at my experience, having worked for CBC North, having worked in media. Although I wasn't a broadcaster, I worked in technical television, so
Oh,
I was a
okay.
behind the camera
Okay,
person.
so I did get it wrong.
No, well, but of course worked on TV news and had input into, the news of the day and the way that we produced shows that would be interesting to people. And so, of course, I actually left the media when I felt it was becoming more infotainment instead of information. I was a big sort of newsy as a kid. My parents, I mean, this is kind of telling of my age, but I used to get to stay up late to watch Knowlton Nash and Barbara Frum. And that was something that kind of shaped me as a kid. I loved that journalism used to be, stories, a pack could be 5 minutes long, a little mini documentary, multiple voices. And then during my time, I was directing CBC North, Igilok, and North Beat. And we moved away from those longer pieces and started getting more of that satellite debris. And I just
Mhm.
felt it was less rewarding. We weren't telling the stories the way I would have liked to see. And so I went to pursue, other things that had always kind of been on my mind in public service, joined as a reservist to work Class B, and then went to the RCMP. But in the beginning, they had sort of a reputational issue up north and had wanted someone with experience dealing with media, or at least able, willing to speak with media to help out. And of course, I did that, and it kind of became one of the things that I was known for, I guess.
But policing is a big commitment and a kind of a vocation as much as a job. What drew you to the RCMP? Was there a family background aspect or some other influence in your life that made you interested in policing?
Yeah, my great uncles on my mom's side were all in the RCMP, and at one time they were the only four brothers at one time in the RCMP together, beginning in the 1940s and going up into the 90s. So that had an influence on me, but also like my dad had always worked in public service, although not as a police officer. He worked for the government of Canada, he worked for the government of Manitoba and government of British Columbia, and that kind of service before self and public service idea was something that was really, we were raised with that. And plus I guess it did help the RCP. I don't know if some of it was a romanticization of what it would be like to be a Mountie, given that my uncles had driven on with dog teams, and one of my uncles was in Air Services West, and he was a pilot flying in the Arctic. And that was a lot different from, by the time I got to policing, the days of patrolling by dog teams and on horseback were gone. But the Crown Vic was still pretty good. I had a lot of fun, but it was a different career from the one that I had probably romanticized about as a kid. But I really loved it. It was a lot of fun. I liked it, and challenging, and
You,
and some things not fun actually, but it was something that I still look on fondly and think about almost every day.
well, you rose to a senior leadership position, and you're a member of the LGBTQ plus community, and you there was a family connection there as well with your uncles, was there not?
Yep. Yeah. My Uncle Dave, actually, he was part of the LGBT purge. So he was fired from the RCMP in 1964 when they suspected him of being a homosexual, which he was. And so, I mean, during that time, it was government policy to find and expel gay people from the public service, under this idea, a false notion actually, that gay people are more susceptible to blackmail. And so, it was really a campaign that a lot of Canadians don't know about, where it was government policy really to hunt gay people down within the public service and expel them from their jobs. And he was part of that, part of it as a victim. Even though, it's kind of interesting. And as I worked, through sort of the psychology of what that means to me, he's both part of an organization that perpetrated these, harms against a community of people, but also himself a victim of it. And I used to do a lot of talks actually when I was a member of the RCMP, because, he had died in 1988, long before I ever became a police officer. And he never lived in the same, world as I did, with the kind of freedom and equality that I experienced. And so I liked to sort of have chats and give talks about how far we've come as a country, because here we were in a time when my uncle, excellent police officer, had been awarded the Queen's Coronation Medal for his work on Canada's Dew Line, working with the Inuit, um, fired for who he was, only for me later to become an openly gay RCMP officer and the spokesperson at one time for Canada's largest RCMP detachment, which, really, I think, signaled a shift in the way that our country views people, and, really an adoption of human rights. And so it's something that still has a lot of meaning for me. It also like complicates, or has for me been a complicated road politically. Because I think even now we're in more of a difficult time, and we see human rights under threat in different parts of the world that we probably would have never expected.
Guess generative AI is everywhere, creating content, music, code, ad scripts, voiceovers, and probably that video you just watched on social media. It's no surprise then that this podcast presenting sponsor TELUS offers its own Gen AI platform. Fuel iX is TELUS's enterprise-grade, award-winning suite of AI products that can be used in English and French Canadian. And unlike those widely used public Gen AI platforms like ChatGPT, Fuel iX is fully customizable. So companies can come to Fuel iX with specific requirements and build a custom platform for their coworkers, with custom security requirements, model restrictions, and the ability to encrypt chat histories, privacy features to keep data secure, and options for data storage so that it remains within Canadian borders. That level of customization reaches right down to Fuel iX's Copilot engine, a conversational AI assistant that helps users with everyday tasks like knowledge searches, summarization, copywriting, and image generation, as well as document and data analysis. The difference here is that businesses can create their own Copilot for any task, so they can define the Copilot's specific role, tone, approach, and set any other parameters as needed, all of it built with trust and privacy in mind. Next week, we'll dive deeper into TELUS's Fuel iX's offerings and how they can support Canadian businesses.
Well, Eleanor, when you jumped to the BC Conservatives, you came to a party that some elements of the party were uncomfortable with these issues, and the debate on social issues was much more perhaps divisive than it might have been in the BC Liberals or BC United. Did you find that, and how did you deal with that when you were in caucus?
I very much found it to be that way. And I got a lot of questions in the beginning about, how could I go to the BC Conservatives? And, I can say that, the discussions that I had prior to coming over, speaking with John Rusted, who was our leader at that time, made it seem like it would be quite a welcoming environment where we would not be focused on social issues, but focused on what I think are the, more important issues for us as a government to be focused on, which would be the economy, access to equitable, timely healthcare, public safety, education. And so, that was the premise under which I had been, invited to be a part of the team. As time went on, actually, I kind of found out that, on the one hand, that was the communication that was being given to me, but some of the original members who had been there since the beginning, that was not the message that they were also receiving, which it did lead to some conflict when we got together. I don't know, if it was sort of forgotten that eventually we might end up in the same room together having some of these conversations, but it did make it complicated for me. And, this wasn't a decision that I had made overnight. But at the time, when I sort of reflect on it now, I look back and I think about, what was I thinking? Part of it was where we are with drug policy, for example, public safety policy, some of those things that I had been really fighting for change in and fighting for, getting the public's attention on certain aspects of public safety, even the work wasn't done. And I was like, am I willing to work in a situation that may not be easy for me? And perhaps have to be less vocal, for example, on some of the things that I like to champion, if it means that I would have the ability to continue to work, on policies that I think, or even in opposition to fight for policy change on things that I think are crucial for the province right now. And ultimately, that was what sort of really had a lot of weight in my decision. And I'm going to be truthful. It was a challenging year. And but I actually don't have any regrets.
What was your original decision, or sorry, Geoff, was it your original decision basically, you said you wanted to continue your work on those issues. Was it just a matter of pragmatically the only way to continue that work was to run as a Conservative because you had already determined that the BC Liberals were just not going to get it done in your riding in Surrey?
You're right. That's exactly
Yeah.
it. I
Yeah.
I felt that the momentum was shifting and that, a lot of it had to do with even the name.
Yeah.
BC United not being a well-known name,
Yeah.
Conservatives being a very well-known name, whether or not the party was actually the same party as the federal Conservatives. Conservatives at the time, this we're talking about, it was at the height of sort of the conservative growth in Canada, a lot of young people joining the party, a lot of people hungry for change. And so, yeah, I actually, prior to even making that decision, I'd been engaged in chats with, Kevin Falcon and, people on the executive at the time wanting to see if there was a way that we would be able to have either an electoral alliance or find a way, to deal with this problem that wouldn't necessarily mean having to have people cross the floor. It wasn't going in that direction. And ultimately, I had to make a decision, and I took a risk. I look at the work that I was able to do, in concert with others, making changes for the province and pushing us in a new direction from where we were, even at the sort of mid-year 2024. And I feel that it was the right decision. It didn't come without personal consequences, I'll say that. But I am still very proud of the work that I've been able to do and the work that I'm still doing even as an independent.
Yeah, you answered my question, but there's so many that follow on from it. I mean, on the one hand, I'm interested in your insights because you do have a background in counseling and you're a specialist in gender studies and relations. You've worked on harassment issues. So you're really into this question. And I wondered if the first part of my question is, did you get an understanding or can you tell listeners what it is that drives those concerns on the other side of the room that you were contending with about, you know, transsexuals or gay kids in schools or you name it? Did you get a better insight into that? And is there a point at which you could see yourself going back into the Conservatives, or is that ship sailed?
Well, as much of what people perceive to be conflict in our caucus as a result of, differing beliefs, we actually didn't spend a lot of time actually having these behind closed doors debates on these issues. It was actually something that at the time the leader had sort of tried to steer us away from having those conversations, instead of, coming to a conclusion. And look, even in terms of SOGI, I'll just say, I believe I was the first person, even before the Conservatives, to ask the government questions about materials that were in schools. I had asked questions of, at the time, it was Rachna Singh was the education minister, and I had brought some examples of materials that weren't necessarily age appropriate or had been causing some trepidations among community members, for their depictions of, graphic sexual images. We had a conversation. It was at that time the government actually said they'd allocated just over 300 grand for reviewing materials to see that they're age appropriate. We actually don't know what the result of that is. So, in terms of the idea that we need to have an alignment on, what is appropriate materials for a school, what kind of information parents should be able to be aware of, in terms of what their kids are learning at school. I'm actually pretty well aligned with people on that. I think as a parent myself, I want to be able to have a hand in guiding my kids' understanding of, the LGBT community, for example. And, parents in British Columbia, as a result of work done by the BC Liberals, actually have the right to opt in or opt out in sex ed for their kids and at least be informed, and even in a lot of school districts participate and have those presentations given to them, which I think is a good thing. I do think that there is a lot of misinformation out there as well. A lot of conflating of things that people, see on websites or have heard that isn't necessarily a true reflection of what's being done in BC schools. And, I find that a little bit bothersome. But again, this isn't something that we actually spent a lot of time, speaking about. I'd often see on, social media, people saying like, oh, Elenore is, she's the one standing in the way of, SOGI or whatever. And it's like, well, actually, people never really ask me, but I think that there is room for us to refresh our, curriculum and have conversations. But I'm also, not one for targeting any specific groups. There's a lot of talk going around right now about, whose washroom is whose and who can, do what. And I think that instead of focusing on any particular group of person, we need to look at if there's some type of harmful behavior, if there's some type of harassment or discrimination or something that's happening, we need to address those specific issues on an individual basis and address problems as they come up instead of targeting groups. And, it is sometimes difficult to navigate, but, we're definitely in a different realm right now in terms of the conversations that are having politically. And I think that it's an important time for me to be here as well.
You've been really outspoken about justice issues and decriminalization. And we've seen the pendulum go back and forth in the last few years. At one point, I think the police were saying, okay, let's give it a shot. And now it's a totally different story where I think the premier on down have viewed it as a failed experiment. You've been pretty consistently vocal on these issues. And how do you size up how this debate has gone over the last couple of years and what the impact has been?
Well, I don't think that we've had enough public disclosure of what the results are. I don't think that the right kind of measures are even being taken. I continue to hear, well, it's a success. We had less arrests. Well, of course, you're going to have less arrests when you make something legal or, by de facto making it legal. But what was the overall public safety, consequence that we had? Did they actually do a fulsome study, across the province, looking at police interactions, looking at street disorder, and then even on the health side separately, what were the health benefits or even negative consequences to health that, really came out of this experiment? Police actually, BCACP, the Association of Chiefs of Police of BC, actually withdrew their support in November 2024, which is only a few months after David Eby had to, at least he said, that they rolled back decriminalization in public spaces, even though we actually continue to have de facto decriminalization everywhere in BC. But I think, again, we heard the premier saying that he thinks that it didn't have the right policy and that it produced actually some, in his words, unhappy consequences. I think, people across the province would use a lot stronger language than that, particularly, look at what's happened with London drugs in the downtown east side. Clint Malman, a quote from him in the media, talked about staff members having to step over feces or having feces thrown at them or, human waste thrown on them on an almost daily basis, which, when you're not taking care of street disorder, whether it's as a result of, any correlation to drug use or not, not treating people with mental illnesses the way that they ought to be cared for, we end up in a situation like we are today. And this is something that drove me to leave my policing career and enter into politics. And I like to think, anyway, maybe this is the a narcissist in me, I suppose. I like to think I had some influence over that. But bringing that frontline perspective about, people saying like, well, the police shouldn't be there treating, people with mental illness. Well, police agree. We need services for people with mental illnesses. We need long-term care for people with mental illness and addictions issues. So we've changed a lot, happily so, from my point of view. And I hope that the premier lets this experiment sunset. I hope that they send new directives to Crown Counsel to consider charges where there's behavioral issues or entanglements with law enforcement and really start shifting towards, an accessible care system for people with these types of issues.
Every January, Prince George becomes the meeting place for BC's resource economy as the BC Natural Resources Forum comes to town. The forum brings together the people and industries that help power our province: forestry, mining, energy, manufacturing, Indigenous leadership, and local governments, all in one place to talk about what's next. From competitiveness and trade to climate resilience and the future of energy in BC, it's where real conversations are happening about how our resource sectors support our provincial economy. As a critical energy provider for these industries, FortisBC is proud to support the Natural Resources Forum. These sectors rely on safe, affordable, and reliable energy, and FortisBC's role is to deliver the energy they depend on today while investing in a stronger, more resilient energy system for the future. BC's gas and electric systems are complementary, working together to meet the needs of homes and businesses across the province. For example, electricity is well suited for light-duty and personal vehicles, while gaseous energy solutions play an important role in medium and heavy-duty transportation. By investing in resilient infrastructure, we can ensure reliable energy delivery, especially when it is needed most. Keep an eye out for FortisBC's team at the BC Natural Resources Forum. FortisBC will be there listening, learning, and engaging about how to keep BC's energy system strong, adaptable, and competitive as priorities evolve. And hey, keep an eye out for me too in Prince George. It'll reach -12, and I'll be the one warming myself up by a cozy gas fireplace. FortisBC, energy for a better BC, a better resource forum, and a better podcast.
Well, many police officers and leaders said, we can't arrest our way out of this crisis, and we could debate the decriminalization thing for a long time. I too have been critical that the whole thing didn't just, when the decision was made to stop, it didn't just stop. We're still having a discussion today. But looking forward, what would your recommendation be to start to tackle the street disorder side? Is it just access to treatment and care? What would you be campaigning for as a member of government or as an opposition frontbencher?
Well, the notion that we can't arrest our way out of it, well, I mean, I think that's always been true and always will be true because arresting someone is only one part of a continuum when it comes to looking at the law and the legality of drug use. And I think that there's a way for us to use the justice system. Yes, arrest people who, for example, someone is, using drugs on a SkyTrain. Maybe we do want to arrest them for possession if they particularly won't stop doing it, or if we know that this is a multiple time offense for this individual. But the arrest is step one. If we can get that person perhaps on possession charges, then diverted to Vancouver Drug Treatment Court, compelling that person towards services, helping point them in the direction, and even giving them supervision and guidance in the community to make changes in their life, while also bringing back that accountability. Sometimes people need to have that kind of incentive in order to have behavior changes. And I think that there's a way for us actually to combine, this sort of healthcare approach with a criminal justice approach by diverting people through that drug court system that already exists in BC, and help people get better. So I think the answer isn't just any one specific ministry, pumping out more results. It's actually a combination. And that goes for housing too. There was a really disturbing post by Fran Yanor from Northern Beat yesterday. She had been given by someone who works in one of these SROs, a picture of someone's house that they live in, just completely hoarded, completely filthy, the conditions that you wouldn't send your worst enemy to, truly. And she said that she was told that police had apprehended a person under the Mental Health Act, and only, they were in distress, and only a couple hours later, they're discharged back into this like literal hellhole. This isn't the kind of care that we should be giving people. It just seems quite inhumane, some of the things that are happening in the province, and I think we need a really comprehensive strategy. So I would campaign for having an overarching, publicly facing, long-term plan that also has short-term publicly facing goals. Like, we don't even know in terms of the premier's mental health strategy, there is no publicly facing plan of what they hope to achieve and where we're going as a province in that regard.
There does really seem to be a fear of involuntary care, whether it's mental health or drug addiction or both. And you just use that example, but I mean, I think the public sees on a regular basis the stories about someone being arrested 100 times and put back on the street. What is that? Where's that reluctance coming from? Was it too many viewings of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? Like, what is it, a hangover from an earlier time of attitudes about institutionalization, or is it money? Is it government just not wanting to invest? Like, where do we got to get to here?
Well, we have involuntary care, and that's one of
Yeah.
the things that I think is really wild, that we keep on having this debate and people saying that, we shouldn't
Yeah.
have forced involuntary care. Well, we have involuntary care for those who need it. Currently, under the Mental Health Act, people can
Mhm.
be provided with involuntary care, including treatment, but not necessarily drug treatment with the goal of sobriety, which I think is often what gets like conflated. People in the election, I think, were asking for involuntary drug treatment, but that actually doesn't exist in British Columbia. Only treatment under the Mental Health Act for mental illness exists, and we have it, in hospitals. We have it also in places like Redfish Healing Center and other, mental health institutions in British Columbia, but also in the forensic psychiatric system, which is for people who have criminal entanglements, and are not fit to stand trial, or were not criminally responsible because of a mental defect. So, it's here. We have it. I think that the biggest issue is that we have activism that often conflates, some of these issues. And one of the things too is that we keep on having comparisons between voluntary and involuntary care. Of course, voluntary care someone who's truly seeking help, that's going to always be our preference to give people help when they need it. Unfortunately, right now in the province, it doesn't exist that way that you could automatically receive help depending on where you are. But involuntary care under certain circumstances shouldn't be compared to voluntary care. It should be compared to involuntary care versus doing nothing at all in a circumstance where a person's life could be at risk, right? Or they're really, a young person who's in jeopardy. I mean, I can't even tell you the impact it has on you when you're an MLA for an area and there's a child that dies in your community, somebody under 18, a young teenager, even kids, before the age of 12 dying of drug overdoses or, attempting suicide. And I mean, these things, until very recently, we didn't see any kind of agreement from the premier or the government that we should allow our healthcare system to even act in these circumstances. I'm happy to see that there's some movement there now, but the reality is, you often hear from, I'm going to say the activist side, saying that people have the right to live at as much risk as they choose for themselves, right? Living at risk is their choice. Well, I think that we really have to evaluate in these circumstances whether or not the person has the ability to make a choice. When we introduced naloxone and started giving people, reviving people who had been without oxygen, we created a huge population of people in our province who have acquired brain injuries, anoxic brain injury. They were deprived of oxygen and their brain has been damaged. And, do all the people that we currently see, do they have the ability to make that decision for themselves? Or is there a need for us to be that caring body of people that actually steps in and provides the assistance that people need? I think that we need to step in.
There's another area that's right up your alley and in your constituency, which is the extortion crisis, which is not controversial. Everybody agrees extortion is an appalling crime. We don't face all of the important ethical and moral debates that we do around drug policy, but it feels like we're getting nowhere to me as a layperson. You've been in the middle of the policing system. Um, what's your take on this? Is this something we can get ahead of? I mean, in the current context with technology and the use of apparently shooters who are one step ahead of deportation anyway, it looks to me like a very, very intractable problem. What prescriptions do you propose for that? Because it's driving, I know, your constituents into deep sense of fear and insecurity.
Yeah, I think step one is recognizing that it's not just a South Asian problem. That's one of the things that's actually kind of bothered me from the beginning is, saying, well, don't worry, it's mostly just targeted at South Asians. It's the feeling that I've got. I think that we're talking.
I think that's fair. Yeah.
And I think that we're talking about something that has a tremendous public safety risk to everybody. Last year we had a more than 100% increase in shootings. And just I think it was like 46 or 47 of those shootings that we ended up having attributed alone to extortions. And then on top of that, we had, numerous gang shootings and then other shootings not related to gangs. So we actually have a pretty significant gun problem in Surrey right now, I would say. The province has a significant gun problem, but we don't see a plan for dealing with guns. On the federal level, there's a lot of talk going on about the, gun buyback programs, but those are targeting people whose firearms statistically are not used significantly in crime. So 90% of crime guns are imported from the United States. The majority of guns, more than 95% of guns used in crime are not lawfully possessed at the time that the crime is carried out. I would like to see the province really come up with a robust plan for dealing with firearms, with guns. In 2024, in January, a new law came out with respect to 3D printed guns because people can honestly print guns. And the only part I think you can't print is the barrel because it would explode if it was made out of plastic, of course. But it wouldn't be that difficult under certain circumstances to make your own handgun. But is that new law having any impact? What kind of information can they give us publicly about that? It's actually, if you get caught downloading plans like that or accessing those websites, it's similar to accessing websites that have child sexual images. And we know that those units themselves don't have enough funding to keep up with the amount of work that they actually have in BC. So do we actually have people assigned to that type of work with respect to 3D printed guns in British Columbia? Do we have a plan for that? If smuggling is, one of the biggest ways in which we're getting illegal firearms into Canada, well, I would suggest the amount of money that the feds have, now put into our border is woefully inadequate, and perhaps the billions of dollars that they're going to be using to administrate a buyback of firearms from, lawful gun owners in Canada would be better spent on the border and, in doing law enforcement and targeted enforcement on smuggling. And I think that, yes, the question that you asked me was about extortion, but in these extortions, we're seeing arsons and shootings. And just down the street from me, one of the homes was shot multiple times. So they get a threat, they report it to the police, their home was targeted, shooting happened there. It was on the news, the police had attended, and only days later shot again. And in 2026, it happened again, where we just had a couple days ago, another house in Surrey, right in my riding, shot a second time within a week. So it's extremely frustrating.
Policing's been such a fraught issue in Surrey, without getting into all of the back and forth over RCMP versus Surrey Police Service. But should there be a reorganization or a higher degree of coordination of policing in BC? Have we got the right mix? Should we consider a provincial police force? Have you had a chance to think about those issues?
A provincial police force would be just so cost prohibitive. I think that honestly, if you look back at the police transition and whether you're, for municipal police or you would wish that we stayed RCMP or whatever your position is, there's no denying that the original green-lit plan, the review that was done by Wally Opal saying it was going to cost, $40 million total. We're like well past that now. It's going to be more than 250 million tax dollars. They're having issues with, recruiting. There's a total recruitment and retention and training crisis in the entire region because, without a comprehensive provincial HR strategy associated to this massive undertaking in Surrey, it's actually destabilized policing in the entire region. So no, I don't think that we should do anything that would change policing in a major shift like that. We need to allow for policing to restabilize. If anything, we don't have the training facilities or capability right now for us to take such an undertaking. If we did, Alberta actually, I think, is on the right track the way that they've decided. I actually went to Alberta last summer around the Stampede. I met with their deputy premier, who's the public safety minister, Mike Ellis, and they've actually decided to make their peace officers, so make sheriffs police officers. So they get extra training. And so in addition to the training that they already have, it actually only represents a little bit more training and allows them to increase the capacity of their policing by like hundreds, if not over 1,000 people, like overnight or essentially in a few months. Which I think, look, if you wanted to have another supplementary police force and you were going to enhance the training for your sheriff's service and allow them to engage in some tasks that maybe they don't do at this time, that's actually kind of a smart way to do it and supplement your RCMP as you continue to build out the other force. But one of the problems here also is that we have a sheriff shortage as well as a policing shortage. I just don't think that right now the province is in a position to make those shifts. They need to really wait for the Surrey policing transition to be complete and finalized, allowing the RCMP to withdraw and stabilize policing across the region before they make any other significant moves. And look, after Picton, a lot of changes got made in policing to the way that police communicate with each other across the province. There's already a real-time information center that shares intelligence among agencies. So police have that ability now to take a coordinated approach, even across jurisdictional lines. There's lots of integrated teams within the Lower Mainland and the Greater Province. So I actually think that, investing in opportunities to have some integrated services is good, and it doesn't necessarily mean you have to create an entire new police force to do it.
Premier David Eby says BC needs people to get back to work, but how are parents, especially mothers, supposed to do that without childcare? When quality childcare is available and affordable, parents can go to work, businesses grow, and BC's economy thrives. The BC government promised $10 a day childcare within 10 years, but 7 years later, only 10% of childcare programs across the province are $10 a day, and early childhood educators are still poorly paid. Here's what the economists say. Since 2019, affordable childcare has added $5.8 billion to BC's GDP and added 33,000 workers, mostly mothers, to the workforce. $10 a day childcare is one of the smartest economic investments our government could make to jumpstart the economy. Help us push BC's government to deliver quality $10 a day childcare for families, for the economy, for all of BC. Visit 10aday.ca to find out more.
You were on the news last week, I think, about an issue of a Surrey councillor intervening on roadside safety checks for drunk driving, where she had reached out to the chief of police. How do you, I mean, I'll use that as a taking off point, how you feel the Surrey police has kind of responded to taking over part of the policing responsibilities in Surrey, because it's still split between Surrey Police Service and RCMP, I think, right now in the transition, right? But are you concerned that there may be issues in terms of how political interference could affect them or how they're comporting themselves?
Yeah, I'm concerned. After that story broke, my primary concern, like, of course, should the counselor have advised, businesses or members of the public just to go through the proper police channels? Yeah, she should have. But the bigger concern for me actually is that why didn't the chief tell her to do that? It appeared anyway, without having, more information, it did appear that, he showed some favoritism there in terms of his direction to his members. But, overall, I think that needs to be looked at. One of the biggest issues with the police force is something that they really don't control, which is, the training. When the NDP greenlit this police force and said, yep, go for it. They didn't increase the number of seats at the Justice Institute in any way that would have actually allowed for this kind of transition. The original plan was based on so many assumptions about how many police officers from the RCMP would patch over, and you can't really. So now that if the SPS is actually having trouble, doing recruiting enough people and making sure that they can train people, that goes back to, Mike Farnworth at the time was the Solicitor General. He was in charge of making sure that there would be adequate and effective policing under the BC Police Act to make sure that the transition would be successful. And I think that they really didn't do that. And now, in many regards, so putting aside this issue of the golf course check stops, if you just look at the tools that the chief was given in order to fulfill his mandate of staffing up this police service, he's been put in a really difficult position. And when you're building a new police force that's also reliant upon bringing people from different jurisdictions together to form a new police force, it is different, because even though we all follow the same laws and provincial statutes, different organizations have different cultures. They have different types of training, even with respect to, workplace culture. And I think that it makes it difficult for the frontline members and will take some time for them to develop their own Surrey Police Service culture. It's just really challenging. So I think that not only are we now faced with this growing problem with extortion, huge gun problem in Surrey, we also have a police force that is trying to do this monumentous, never been done in BC before task of taking the largest RCMP detachment and turning it now into this, huge police force. And it's a really hard job. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the groundwork that was laid by the NDP, and really they need to take some responsibility for that.
So,
Okay.
Yeah,
We could go on for a long
Geoff?
time. I just think, well, just briefly, there were votes there by mayoralty candidates that really complicated the question. And I think you're putting your finger on two really important questions. One is, uh, should we have a better capacity to deal with crimes like extortion, which I would submit are fundamentally international in nature, being directed and managed even by people who are far offshore, who knows where, who can pick targets, employ people who are going to do the shootings at the local level. This is a set of issues, including the fentanyl business and a set of other things, which we have in a very big way in the province, and so far do not seem to be able to get ahead of in terms of policing. Maybe nobody can, maybe they can't elsewhere. And that's where I see a need for more coordination and maybe more expenditure. I'm not too worried about whether or not we're catching people who are drunk driving. I think local police forces and the RCMP are really good at that, and a whole bunch of other things, including chasing people who are running through my neighborhood, having conducted a theft. I see really strong response to that. So that's the bigger debate, and I think you're uniquely located to speak to that larger question and educate people about those issues, because the London drugs question is also a shoplifting question, not just a street disorder question. And so we see these things coming together right across the board, right from the, as you say, the grassroots level, people down the street having their place shot up, right up to some of the super labs and so on that are pumping out pills at a staggering rate. And so far, very, very difficult for the police to get ahead of that or describe what a strategy would look like. So thanks for hearing me out.
Yeah. And you know what? It's funny because a lot of these investigations, believe it or not, like having an impaired driving check stop is also helpful when you have extortions, because they're stopping vehicles in an affluent area at the time in Morgan Creek. They're gathering intelligence on who is coming and going in that neighborhood. So I think, even when we talk about decriminalization and I say what kind of impact did it have, on crime, when I was policing, we would detain people for investigation who, were using drugs, not necessarily because we want to lay charges on that person, but you're having a conversation. There's opportunities that are there that that person might share information, that person might decide that they want to help the police, and there's actually value in having those kinds of interactions with the people. And that was changed because of decriminalization. So even some of these smaller things that happen at the municipal level can actually, be part of a larger investigational web that actually can help address some of these bigger things. But, I think the lack of investment, or I can remember even doing some videos over the summer talking about, precursors coming into the country and maybe because it was Kash Patel or whatever, I remember Ravi Kailon getting very upset and saying this was all misinformation, that we don't have a problem with exporting drugs here in Canada. And perhaps we don't see the level of fentanyl leaving Canada as has been claimed by, our neighbors, but the amount of crystal meth that's coming out of Canada certainly has been a huge problem for places like New Zealand and Australia. We do have a big problem with drugs here, especially in BC, that's become a hub of drug production, and which is actually something that's stated in Canadian criminal intelligence reports. So,
Yeah.
Well, Eleanor, will you slip through a conservative dragnet in the coming months if they try to bring you back into caucus, or how are you assessing your political future going forward? I mean, you're sitting as an independent MLA. You certainly hasn't stopped you from having a loud voice. You're on the news regularly as an independent MLA, but obviously looking ahead to the next election, it's tough for independent MLAs to get elected. So how are you sizing up things right now?
well, I'm curious to see how the leadership race goes. I'm actually hoping that they're going to become an inclusive party that, has a lot of space for people from the center right across the political spectrum who want to work together on issues, that are really impacting the entire province, not necessarily getting bogged down in, the everyday personal decisions of British Columbians, but, wanting to work together on providing that, financial stability, the economic framework, that healthcare framework, that people rely upon as a province. And so I'm curious to see. I already see lots of different messages from, a couple of the contenders that, I'm not sure if that would be a good fit for me if they were the leader. So I guess I'll have to see. I guess I'm going to have to find out, just like other British Columbians who right now also feel maybe politically homeless. people in the center contact me a lot to ask me, my thoughts and where I might go. But I just like everybody else, I'm waiting to sort of find out what happens. There are certain things that I think, as a British Columbian, that are not a good fit for me. In terms of any of the narrative on residential school denialism, for example, it's not anything that I would ever support or, want to be associated with. And so I think, I'll be very careful in making any future decisions and watching closely what happens.
Do you
Okay.
support the repeal of DRIPA?
Yes, I do. And there's a difference between wanting to go back to, relying upon Section 32 of the Constitution and making sure that the broader, public interest is recognized as we go forward through Indigenous land claims and settling issues with respect to title. I've actually entered a private member bill, which is still on the papers, to repeal Section 8(1) of the Interpretation Act, which requires all statutory decision makers to interpret BC's laws and statutes in a way that doesn't derogate from DRIPA. But there's a difference between wanting to continue to work on reconciliation and have partnerships with First Nations, working from, through a lens of a balanced public interest versus being a residential school denier, or being a racist. And I think that's why it's important for us to make sure that when we have these conversations that we're really clear about our intentions and what is it that we really want to achieve from the legislation that we present and from the narratives that we want to put forward.
Well, we'll have to reconcile our schedule here and leave it at that. Elenore, thank you very much for stopping by Hotel Pacifico and having our initial audience with you. And we hope you'll come back and visit soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, we're back in the strategy suite. Geoff and I, raindrops keep falling on my head.
You're singing Prince Rupert song?
I am. The Prime Minister is in Prince Rupert this week, meeting with coastal First Nations, because an oil pipeline might be dropping on their head. And that's what he's gone to go talk to them about. I think he's brought Minister Tim Hodgson along with him, who's the energy minister. They're having a meeting in Prince Rupert at Chance's Casino. And true insiders at Hotel Pacifico will know where Chance's Casino is in Prince Rupert, just down the street from the Crest Hotel.
Yeah.
That's where everybody goes to get lucky. So, I wonder how many prime ministers have had meetings in bingo palaces. What do you think?
I'm not sure.
Probably
Probably
a few.
not that many.
Johnny McDonald, probably. So,
I've been to a few gatherings at the Ocean View, which was a really great place with a fabulous harbor view, and the Crest is nice too.
Chris is
But
nice.
I think it's interesting that Hodgson went because you remember that he got in trouble for laughing off the demand for a meeting, saying we have Zoom calls if you really want to get together. So he's face to face now with these Indigenous leaders along with the Prime Minister. So that will probably get them over the protocol hump. It'll be interesting to see what the feedback is.
They'll go in and take their lumps. Yeah.
Yeah.
I assume. I mean, the news will report it out before this podcast drops, so I won't speculate on what happened inside the room, other than the fact that he's shown up there shows that the federal government's following through on the next stage and who they need to talk to on the MOU stuff. We know that Danielle Smith is way ahead in terms of talking about it and speculating where it might go. She's speculating it could be in Prince Rupert, or on our pod. She said that, or she was a little cool to Kitimat.
Yep.
But she's now also talking to the media about Roberts Bank and Delta as a potential site for an oil terminal, which is where the Port of Vancouver has plans to build a container port. So lots of
Well,
things
this is
in the
not
air.
to disparage anything in the north because the habitat there is incredible, but the Roberts Bank terminal is in the mouth of the largest salmon river in the world and also one of the most important flyways. So the environmental issues at Roberts Bank are not trivial, which is, I think, an important reason why the Burrard Inlet terminal was done for TMX expanded there. So we'll see whether they go all the way out to the estuary of this huge river. I can't imagine the risks that would then attend that kind of a
Well, something's going to be built at
situation.
Roberts Bank,
Yeah, but it
like,
won't be oil. It's going to be a whole
yeah,
bunch of other things, containers and
maybe.
things like that, that hopefully float to shore and you get out the running shoes and everybody carries on.
In the mud flats there. I saw a quote in the media from Art Starrett, who's used to lead Coastal First Nations, I believe. And he said, I'm just going to paraphrase here. We have all the wildlife, we have the fish, the halibut, the salmon. We are not an impoverished group of people. It's not like we need a job. And the other thing is, there are no jobs in this. There are no jobs in pipelines. There are no jobs in tankers. And I thought,
Mhm.
okay, I get the point. But this comes to a bit of a debate here as to whose coastline is it? I think everybody gets that the First Nations have a huge impact, and their rights are very important on the coastline, but it is also the rest of Canada's coastline too. And so I can see the polling that from the rest of Canada that feel like these types of projects are needed. I know it has to go through a process and there's going to be a reaction to it and public attitudes may change, but I'm not sure that First Nations positioning of just like a flat no is necessarily going to cut the mustard here, in terms of what the public's expectations are to at least
Well, there
have
needs to be a
discussions about it.
much broader discussion because I think
Uh,
the North Coast is not a park. It's used for many industrial activities, including
yeah,
logging, and there's tourism, and there's an
yeah,
enormous amount of natural beauty there. But I think the federal government is going to have to clarify some of the questions you're raising because Alberta does not see it as Canada's oil. They see it as Alberta's oil, and
yeah.
they see it as a inherent right to get that to market as Alberta's oil. They don't see it as Canada's oil. We'll see how that all plays
But
out
it
right
is,
now with the
yeah,
Venezuela change.
yeah. I mean,
Hmm?
separation of powers. It is Alberta's oil in terms of the jurisdiction over natural resources. But at the end of the day, um, there are jobs in pipelines and there are jobs in oil because of the tax revenues that are generated from oil that will go to the federal government. And the
Yeah,
equalization
but
that comes from Alberta to support other provinces in Canada is significant.
well,
Alberta is a cash
yeah,
cow for Canada.
well, I get that all that, but I think that at that level, then this conversation has to happen with BC, which happened under your
Yeah,
administration, happened under
yeah,
Horgan's. But well, what are the trade-offs, and what are we,
yeah,
and how will the revenue be shared and the risk? And at this stage, we're not having that with Venezuela now. I can't tell
yeah,
whether it's more important to have this extra pipeline now that Venezuela may ramp up production under Trump, or whether it's
yeah.
less necessary. It's really not clear to me. So we'll see. I think there's still no proponent, and I saw an interesting interview on the weekend from the former Sonia Savage, former energy minister in Alberta under Jason Kenney, saying there just isn't a proponent, and she sees zero probability there will be one, according to one report I saw. So
Well,
a lot of stuff to come on that front.
yeah. Okay. Well, let's put a pin on that, and we'll
Yeah,
come
we'll
come
be
back
back
to it.
again and
And
again and again.
yeah, and just to be, if I'm Art Starrett or I'm Coastal First Nations, that would be my opening gambit too, and then maybe their closing statement as well. But I mean, we got to have the conversation. Okay, Premier's in India, um, or he's maybe returning soon, but he's been there with Minister Ravi Kahlon, looking to drum up business. But next week he'll be in Prince George, with a whole suite of ministers and deputy ministers and all sorts of provincial public servants at
This
this
is the
very
BC Resources
BC
Forum
Natural Resources
every
Forum, which
year.
I
Yeah.
go on ad nauseum about. But it is there'll be about 1,600 people there, and a lot of projects that are potential. There's potential mines, potential LNG terminals. There's a lot of forestry operators there. There's a lot of billions of dollars in that room waiting to be invested in under the right circumstances, whether it's market conditions or whether it's regulatory support they need or First Nations agreements or whatever. So that's an important trade mission for the Premier to go to Prince George next week. Um, it looks like he will continue to beat the drum that he started last year to try to talk about fast tracking projects and try to, celebrate decisions that are made to invest. There was one a couple of weeks ago. The government announced environmental approval for the Mount Milligan mine extension,
Hmm.
in near Fort St. James, which will keep that mine going for another 10 years. Um, and that was on their fast track list last year, but more to come, I assume.
Well, I think the challenge for the government is that a trip to India is always one of those coin tosses because the payback is as much political as economic. Of course, there's important relationships between India and Canada, and it's a potentially very large trading partner. But many of the things, in my experience, that are really desirable for importers from India, investors, and so on, may be located elsewhere in Canada. For example, agricultural crops like lentils and pulses and things like that, which would be part of their agricultural needs, is something that they would be very, very interested in. Whether they want to invest in forestry or in critical minerals and things like that, I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
So it's a good
It's a
trip
long way to India.
politically.
It's a
It's a
long
long way to
way.
India, but as I
Yeah.
think it's a political trip. And then, of course, as the previous prime minister found, Justin Trudeau, there's a political risk to the trip as well. If you get your picture taken with the wrong person or make bad wardrobe
Yeah.
choices,
Yeah.
you can wind up in difficulty. So
Yeah.
I think they'll be back. They kept it small on purpose, but the resource forum is a bigger challenge. Don't you think the only discussion there will be DRIPA?
It will
And
be a big one. Yeah.
yeah,
I mean,
and whether BC is investable or whether private property is over here as a result of a court
well, there
decision.
was another First Nations related court ruling just in the past week or so. I'll note that BC Supreme Court judge sent a decision to transfer a forest license in Northwest BC back to the government because the Gitnell hereditary chiefs had sought a judicial review, saying that the government had failed to consult with them. I think Bob Palmer's written about this as well. Justice Matthew Kirshner said that the license area includes a significant portion of territory over which the Gitnell claims Aboriginal rights, including title, and the province failed to meet its constitutional duty to consult. So, I think that's
But there's an overlap there, Mike. It's important for our listeners to know that
yeah,
there's two First Nations who say the territory in question is part of theirs, and
yeah.
consultation occurred with the other one, not with the people who are launching the litigation.
And the forest licensee is controlled by one of the First Nations,
Yeah.
Kitsum-Kalem. So, I mean, I think the point I take away from it is just that this is complicated stuff, and it's, obviously not a great signal when, a government process has failed in its duty to consult and the courts, intervene on that. Obviously, you would not want these things to happen if we were in a predictable environment.
Yeah, and
I don't
I
think
think
that's
this
got
is
anything to do
what.
with DRIPA either, by the way. I think it's
Well,
just
no, the overlap issue
Section
is one
35.
that has been there all along. And if you look at the Cowichan decision, there's appeals being launched by two other First Nations, the Tsawwassen First Nation and the Musqueam. Both don't like the outcome there. That appeal will take a long, long time to sort itself out, but we are a long way from knowing the final outcome in Cowichan, in spite of the political crisis that seems to be brewing around it. Similarly, the Kasai Sims natural gas
Citizens, yeah.
terminal is on land which was not originally, as I recall, treaty lands, but was later reallocated, I think, during the time you were in the West Annex, Mike. And that was protested by neighboring First Nations as well, who felt it was improper that the land was actually theirs. But it's been incorporated in the treaty lands, and the Niska, I think, are using that for the location, or nearby at least, for the terminal for this new pipeline. So a lot is at play here. You can't this is going to be a challenge for First Nations down the road and for so-called economic reconciliation, whether or not we have DRIPA, which is intended to try to overcome some of these problems.
Mhm. Well, let's move on to the conservative leadership race. Now, we Hotel Pacifico got a worldwide exclusive yesterday, thanks to our friends at Cursive Politics. Cursive Politics panelist Corey Tenike proactively announced he was going to move to BC to support manage Caroline Elliott's leadership campaign. Kind of got ahead of the leadership announcement. We managed to tweet a clip out on the Hotel Pacifico Twitter account, and I think caused a bit of a stir. Um, where attention all leadership campaigns, please consider Hotel Pacifico as your source for breaking news and for telling us lots of secret things that we can tell the listeners. But Corey is a high octane, controversial, charismatic campaign manager who is going to command a lot of attention as a backroom guy bringing that to Caroline Elliott's campaign. And there's already a lot of commentary about it. That Corey said some hard things about the Poilievre campaign, the last federal election. Some federal conservatives remain a bit sore about that. Some people are saying, here comes an outsider from outside the province, and how could she do that? But, you know, he's a winner. You
Yeah,
know,
I don't.
he's won
Well, you're
campaigns.
way closer to these leadership drives than I am, Mike. I mean, but all I've learned from watching them is you can never tell till it's over. I mean,
Yeah,
Christy
exactly.
Clark had the support of a single caucus member. She became the leader,
Mhm.
then went forward and won an election. And a lot of people who'd opposed her were really glad she won that election. I remember
Mhm.
Sam Sullivan saying Christy Clark is God, and he hadn't been a notable supporter of hers previously. Then Andrew Wilkinson
Yeah,
won the next race.
yeah.
Diane Watts and Kevin Falcon, who were seen as naturals, well,
Oh,
Diane was never able to make it,
right.
and Kevin, we know what happened there, more or less. So, who do you think is the dark horse that may surprise everyone this time?
Well, in terms of the show horses, I'll mention Chris Gardner, who had a op-ed in Northern Beat this week. He was adding his voice to the chorus, saying DRIPA had to be repealed,
Yeah.
as did Yuri Fulmer. His backroom is growing. He'll have Jordan Bateman there, but one of Jordan's co-conspirators, Hamish Marshall, who's a conservative pollster and was the key guy behind Andrew Scheer's leadership campaign, he's expected to be helping Chris. So it'll be interesting to see how these backroom players formulate. One candidate who we haven't heard a lot from, although he said he's strongly interested in running, is Ian Black. And Ian brings elected experience as well as business experience to the table. He's also from a strategic region of the province when it comes to winning swing seats, which is Coquitlam, Port Moody Coquitlam area, which he represented. So he's got a few things in his favor. I'm told that he's going to announce this week probably, and they're lining up, volunteers and expect to see some interesting names as campaign co-chairs. And then one of the key organizers behind Ian Black is Dimitri Panagopoulos, who's, again, another guy who's accustomed to winning campaigns, including Andrew Wilkinson's, among others. And he was a key player in Christy Clark's campaign for leadership and 2013 win. So I'm also told that Carrie Lynn Finley is in or will be in. Contrary to what I said last week, I said I didn't think she would run last week. Well, I'm told I was given a tut tut. Mike, you're wrong. She's going to run. So there you go.
Well, I'd be
Um,
interested to see the rules because I very much respect Corey Tenike. He's got a fabulous wardrobe. He doesn't pick pull-up stakes and move out here for pro bono work. Ian Black, likewise, bring in Dimitri
uh,
Pantazopoulos, top national pollster.
yeah,
He and the others that are going to be around them are all going to cost a significant amount of money, and we don't know yet what the rules are. So it'll
yeah,
be very interesting to see and where the money
yeah.
comes from.
Yeah, and I'm also interested to see who Peter Milbar brings in behind his team too, and he'll be in the mix for sure. I would be concerned if I were an endangered species in British Columbia because Corey might end up wearing that species as part of his wardrobe. So be careful, spirit bears. You might see Corey walking down the street in a spirit bear coat. Um,
Well,
but
I noticed that it's a very we didn't mention Harman Bangu, who may
Oh, Harmon Bangu
still
too,
go,
yeah.
right? Harman and then the two women are the only sort of diversity candidates. Not that you want to be known as a diversity candidate in conservative circles, I guess, but the rest of the list are very much, I would say, more old school candidates with long BC Liberal pedigrees, and maybe there'll be a
Well,
shakeup and a change
Peter
coming.
Millibar would say he's from Kamloops.
Yeah,
So
yeah. There's a lot of people
um,
from Kamloops.
Yuri Fomer owns A&Ws. He's the only one in the race who does that.
Mhm.
So, anyways, yeah, yes, diversity, not a lot of it. Okay, well, let's head to the minibar.
You gonna go first? You want me to go first?
Why don't you go first?
All right, I've been thinking a lot about the upcoming session and the debate that we will have on DRIPA because the Premier clarified that he will be definitely bringing in some amendments to DRIPA, notwithstanding a clear call from a lot of Indigenous organizations not to do so. So I'm thinking today and raising a glass to three MLAs who are Indigenous women. Lanas Tamara Davidson from Haida Gwaii, uh, Amshin Joan Phillip from Penticton, of course, but she's been living in Vancouver. She represents Vancouver Strathcona. And Quiltstanat Deborah Toporowski, I hope I pronounced that right. She's the Cowichan MLA. All three of them are from organizations that signed the letter to David Eby calling on him not to bring in amendments. And so I have a lot of respect for all of those women, as I'm sure the rest of the caucus, but they're in a particularly difficult spot, I think, as this debate begins to unfold. And I'll be thinking of them because I'm pretty sure they will all conduct themselves with great integrity, and we'll see what that looks like for them and how that debate plays out.
Okay. And I would also add that on the other side of the coin, Alia Warbus will be playing an important role in that debate too, I'm sure,
Yeah,
from the
very
conservative
much
side.
so. Yeah.
Yeah. I've got a couple. On another show slash podcast the other day, Momir, I heard Angelo Isidoro, the head of the BC Conservative Party organization, I think he's executive director or whatever the title is.
I think that's right.
He opined that that the support for the Conservatives is so strong they could be heading to a 2001 situation where they wipe out the NDP. And I would just say, Angelo, who I do not really know, manage expectations. That's I don't I I can tell you it's a mixed blessing having 77 out of 79 seats because the public wants opposition. The public wants a balanced debate, or at least a debate in the legislature. And I know that the BC Liberals were a little, uh, not as magnanimous as they should have been, frankly, to the NDP two-member caucus at the time. And I think that worked against them in that term. And the public rebalanced it next election very strongly, brought the NDP up to like 35 seats or something. So I don't think there are necessarily really fond memories of having a legislature that has a wipeout. So I would just say win by one seat. That would be good if you're the BC Conservatives. Just win by one seat. Well, hopefully more if you're a BC Conservative, but just win. Like you don't need to be talking about landslides. In my
Sound
opinion.
advice.
And I'd just like to raise a glass to one of our regular listeners. Her name is Chloe. Chloe, congratulations on your Canadian citizenship. I hope that listening to Hotel Pacifico helped you pass the citizenship exam. And I hope you will spread the message of civil discourse and democracy from Hotel Pacifico to all new Canadians you come across, especially those from your homeland of Australia. So congratulations. Raise a glass. There you go. Thanks to Elenore Sturko for visiting Hotel Pacifico this week. And thanks to our sponsors for allowing us to bring this episode to you for free. We'll see you next week. BC, you can never leave.